Welcome, listener, to a deep dive into Money, Lies, and God by Katherine Stewart. Katherine Stewart's Money, Lies, and God opens a window into a shadowy, sprawling movement that she argues threatens the very foundations of American democracy. With a journalist's eye for detail and a storyteller's knack for weaving disparate threads into a cohesive narrative, Stewart takes us on a journey through the intersections of wealth, deception, and religious fervor that fuel what she calls a distinctly American strain of authoritarianism. The book, published in 2025 by Bloomsbury Publishing, builds on her previous works like The Power Worshippers and The Good News Club, but here she casts a wider net, examining how moneyed interests, ideological lies, and a warped theology converge to undermine the democratic ideals enshrined in the nation's founding. In this summary, we'll explore the introduction and the first two chapters of Part 1, Money, immersing ourselves in Stewart's vivid reporting and incisive analysis, before considering how her findings might apply to real-world scenarios. Introduction, setting the stage in Las Vegas and Verona. The book begins with Stewart standing amidst a crowd of right-wing activists on a sweltering summer day in Las Vegas in 2023. The scene is visceral. A man in a MAGA cap and a Size Matters t-shirt, referring to bullet sizes, poses for her camera, his expression a mix of jest and menace as he warns her not to humiliate her husband. Nearby, another man in a Make Men Men Again shirt glares with barely concealed aggression, while women in patriotic garb sport slogans and gun imagery targeting rhinos, Republicans in name only. Booths hawk January 6th memorabilia, raising funds for those Stewart describes as incarcerated patriots. This is not a new scene for her. After 15 years covering such gatherings, she notes the t-shirts have grown nastier, but it's a stark contrast to a memory from 2019 when she attended the World Congress of Families in Verona, Italy. In Verona, the setting was a 17th-century palazzo, the attendees a polished mix of American, Russian, and European activists railing against LGBT totalitarians and global liberalism. Among them was John Eastman, a California law school dean whose unremarkable speech on gender confusion belied his later infamy as a key figure in Donald Trump's 2020 election subversion efforts, earning him the moniker co-conspirator too in federal indictments. Stewart uses these two vignettes, Las Vegas's raw populism and Verona's genteel extremism, to frame her central thesis. A diverse, well-funded anti-democratic movement is coalescing in America, rejecting Enlightenment ideals of equality and reason for a vision rooted in a particular religion and culture, posing the gravest threat to democracy since the Civil War. Stewart positions herself as a reporter first, prioritizing facts over polemics, though she doesn't shy away from pointed conclusions. She argues this movement isn't a mere misunderstanding or partisan squabble. It's a deliberate assault on democracy, driven by leaders and backers who exploit division and disinformation. She traces its roots to economic inequality, cultural divides, and a half-century of structural shifts, dismissing the notion that it began with Trump's 2015 candidacy. Instead, she sees it as a long-brewing reaction, fueled by wealth disparities that have birthed an oligarchic elite and a resentful underclass, both manipulated by a network of funders, thinkers, and activists. The introduction outlines her methodology, dispatches from the front lines, conferences, churches, and living rooms, featuring a cast of apostles, billionaires, and spirit warriors. She identifies 5 key groups: funders, thinkers, sergeants, infantry, and power players, whose interactions drive the movement's momentum. The funders, like Betsy DeVos and the Koch brothers, pour money into the cause. The thinkers, often from elite institutions, provide intellectual cover. The sergeants mobilize local action. The infantry supply votes, and the power players wield influence. Stewart labels this reactionary nihilism, a rejection of reason and democracy, cloaked in nostalgic fantasies of a Christian nation that never was. Her goal is clear: to expose this threat and urge readers to recognize its gravity. Part 1. Money, Chapter 1. California Dreaming. In Chapter 1, California Dreaming, Stewart shifts to the Golden State, a paradoxical battleground where progressive ideals clash with a burgeoning anti-democratic insurgency. She introduces us to a trio of funders whose wealth and whims are reshaping education and politics. A minor league real estate scion, the wife of a Pepsi heir, and a secretive billionaire known as Albert Howell. These figures, she argues, epitomize the movement's reliance on dark money. Untraceable funds funneled through opaque networks to dismantle public institutions like education, which they see as bastions of secular liberalism. Stewart's narrative zooms in on the real estate scion, whom she doesn't name but describes as a devout Christian obsessed with destroying public schools in Jesus' name. His fortune, modest by billionaire standards, fuels a crusade against what he calls government indoctrination, bankrolling charter schools and voucher programs that siphon public funds to religious institutions. She recounts a visit to one such school, where the curriculum blends Bible study with anti-government rhetoric, painting a picture of a privatized education system that prioritizes ideology over equity. Next, we meet the Pepsi heiress, whose wealth supports election disinformation campaigns. Stewart describes a glossy fundraiser she attended, where the heiress mingled with activists plotting to secure future elections. Code, Stewart suggests, for suppressing votes and spreading lies about fraud. The third figure, Albert Howell, is a Chicago-based billionaire hiding behind a pseudonym, a nod to Elbert Hubbard and Gilligan's Island's millionaire. His money flows to think tanks and legal defenses for January 6th figures, including John Eastman, linking California's elite to the national anti-democratic web. Stewart ties these stories to a broader argument. The funders aren't geniuses but reactionaries, driven by simplistic beliefs that democracy hinders their prosperity. Their outsourcing of strategy to thinkers, like those at the Claremont Institute, amplifies their impact, turning personal crusades into systemic assaults. California, with its progressive facade, becomes a testing ground for their vision of a privatized, theocratic future. Part 1. Money. Chapter 2. A Tale of Two Bushes. Chapter 2. A Tale of Two Bushes takes us to Missouri, home of the Bush family, beer magnates whose wealth has long influenced American politics. Stewart focuses on two lesser-known Bushes, not August 3 or 4, she clarifies, whose divergent paths illustrate the movement's dual tracks, one funding legal battles, the other grassroots agitation. This chapter deepens her exploration of how money translates into power, spotlighting the funders' role in both high-level strategy and street-level chaos. The first Bush, a reclusive heir, channels his fortune into legal advocacy groups like the Federalist Society, which Stewart portrays as a pipeline for conservative judges who dismantle regulatory frameworks and entrench religious privilege. She recounts a conference where his proxies boasted of deconstructing the administrative state, a phrase echoing throughout the book as a euphemism for gutting democratic oversight. His money, she notes, helped secure Supreme Court seats for justices like Neil Gorsuch, whose rulings favor corporate and religious interests over public welfare. The second Bush is a wilder figure, a self-styled populist who bankrolls militia-style groups and January 6th rallies. Stewart paints a scene from a rural Missouri gathering. Pickup trucks, Confederate flags, and a Bush-funded speaker railing against elites while sipping a Budweiser. This Bush, she argues, represents the movement's infantry, angry, disenfranchised Americans whose economic woes are redirected into cultural grievances. His cash keeps the chaos alive, funding patriot defenses and amplifying stolen election lies. Stewart contrasts these Bushes to highlight a symbiotic dynamic. The legal Bush builds the infrastructure, the populist Bush mobilizes the masses. Both reject the American idea of equality and reason, favoring a hierarchy where wealth and faith dictate rule. She weaves in data, wealth concentration doubling for the top 0.1% since 1970, per her sources, tying their actions to broader inequality that fuels the movement's rage. Examples for application. Stewart's insights offer practical lessons for understanding and countering this anti-democratic tide. Here are 3 examples. 1. Education advocacy. Chapter 1's focus on California's education wars suggests a strategy for pro-democracy groups. By exposing dark money's role in privatization, like the real estate scions charter schools, activists could push for transparency laws, mandating disclosure of funding sources for educational initiatives. Public campaigns could highlight how these efforts erode equitable access, rallying parents and teachers to defend public schools as democratic cornerstones. 2. Election integrity. The Pepsi heiress's disinformation funding in Chapter 1 and the populist Bush's election lies in Chapter 2 underscore the need for robust counter-narratives. Community organizations could deploy fact-checking workshops, using Stewart's examples to train voters to spot propaganda. Partnering with tech platforms to flag dark money-backed misinformation could also curb its spread, protecting electoral trust. 3. Policy reform. The legal Bush's judicial influence in Chapter 2 points to a structural fix, reforming campaign finance and judicial appointment processes. Advocates could use Stewart's evidence to lobby for caps on political donations from individuals like the Bushes, reducing their outsized impact. Strengthening ethics rules for judges tied to groups like the Federalist Society could also limit the movement's legal foothold. Part 1. Money. Chapter 3. Schools Out Forever. Chapter 3. Schools Out Forever picks up where California Dreaming left off, zooming out from California to a nationwide war on public education. Stewart frames this as a cornerstone of the anti-democratic movement, where funders and their allies seek to dismantle a system they view as a breeding ground for secularism and wokeness. She begins in Florida, at a Moms for Liberty summit, where the air buzzes with parental outrage and patriotic fervor. Women in red, white, and blue attire clutch signs decrying critical race theory and gender ideology, while speakers, backed by dark money from figures like Betsy DeVos, call for school choice and privatization. Stewart notes the irony. Many of the banned books they rail against aren't even in school libraries, yet the rhetoric ignites the crowd. She introduces a key funder, a Texas oil tycoon named Tim Dunn, whose fortune has turned the Lone Star State into a laboratory for educational upheaval. Dunn's money flows through the Texas Public Policy Foundation, pushing vouchers that redirect public funds to private, often religious, schools. Stewart visits one such institution, describing a classroom where students recite prayers alongside lessons on American exceptionalism, a curriculum shaped by Hillsdale College, a conservative bastion tied to the movement. Dunn, she argues, isn't just funding schools. He's bankrolling a vision of education that rejects pluralism for a theocratic mold, aligning with the movement's broader rejection of the American idea. Stewart also spotlights the infantry, parents, and local activists who amplify this agenda. At a school board meeting in Ohio, she observes a sergeant, a pastor doubling as a board member, rallying the crowd against LGBT indoctrination. His fervor, she suggests, is less about policy than performance, a ritual of grievance that binds the group. The chapter ties these threads to economic inequality. As public schools falter under defunding, the wealthy secure elite alternatives, leaving the rest to fight over scraps, a divide the movement exploits to stoke resentment. Part 2. Lies. Chapter 4. The Room Where It Happens. With Chapter 4, The Room Where It Happens, Stewart transitions into Part 2, peeling back the curtain on the movement's strategic core. She takes us to a closed-door meeting of the Council for National Policy, CNP, in a plush Washington, D.C. hotel, where power players, lobbyists like Ralph Reed and Tony Perkins, hobnob with funders and thinkers. The air is thick with cigar smoke and ambition as they plot to redeem America, a phrase Stewart decodes as code for authoritarian control. Her access is limited. She's there as an observer, not a participant. But the snippets she catches reveal a chilling pragmatism. Discussions of voter suppression, judicial appointments, and messaging to keep the infantry riled up. Stewart introduces Leonard Leo, a Federalist Society kingpin whose influence over the Supreme Court has reshaped American law. His network, funded by dark pools like the Judicial Crisis Network, is a linchpin in deconstructing the administrative state, a goal she traces back to the Bushes in Chapter 2. She recounts a moment when Leo, urbane and besuited, boasts of stacking the bench with justices like Brett Kavanaugh, whose rulings erode regulatory power and elevate religious privilege. This isn't chaos, Stewart argues. It's a calculated power grab, where lies about judicial overreach mask a bid to entrench minority rule. The chapter also delves into the thinkers, spotlighting the Claremont Institute's role in crafting intellectual cover. Stewart recalls a Claremont event where Charles Kessler, a prominent scholar, rails against multiculturalism as a betrayal of America's Judeo-Christian roots. His words, polished yet venomous, echo in the CNP room, where they're distilled into talking points for Fox News and pastors' sermons. Stewart sees this as a feedback loop. Money buys influence, influence spreads lies, and lies justify more money, a machine humming with purpose. Part 2. Lies, Chapter 5, The Permanent Emergency. Chapter 5, The Permanent Emergency, plunges into the movement's propaganda engine, where fear and crisis are weaponized to keep supporters mobilized. Stewart starts at a Reawaken America tour stop in Tulsa, Oklahoma, a carnival of conspiracy and charisma. The stage pulses with figures like Mike Flynn and Lance Wallnau, who blend QAnon rants with spiritual warfare rhetoric, warning of a deep state bent on destroying real Americans. The crowd, Stewart's infantry, laps it up, their t-shirts emblazoned with guns and Bible verses, their cheers a mix of rage and rapture. She introduces Wallnau, a self-styled prophet of the New Apostolic Reformation, whose Seven Mountains ideology calls for Christians to dominate culture and government. His sermon, laced with violent imagery, casts elections as cosmic battles, a narrative Stewart ties to January 6's Spirit Warriors. The lies here are blatant: stolen elections, satanic elites, but potent, sustained by funders like the Wilkes brothers, Texas oil barons who bankroll the tour. Stewart attends a breakout session where attendees learn fifth-generation warfare, a blend of disinformation and prayer, underscoring the movement's performative nihilism. Stewart contrasts this with a quieter crisis, the 2021 Texas blizzard, where deregulation, pushed by funders like Dunn, left millions freezing as the grid failed. The movement spun it as liberal tyranny, deflecting blame from their own policies. This permanent emergency, she argues, is the glue holding the coalition together, turning economic woes and cultural shifts into endless fuel for grievance. It's not about solutions, she concludes, but about keeping the faithful angry and obedient. Examples for application. Stewart's revelations in chapters 3 to 5 offer actionable insights for resisting this anti-democratic surge. Here are 3 examples. 1. Strengthening public education. Chapter 3's education battle suggests a grassroots counteroffensive. Communities could form coalitions, like a Defend Our Schools network, using Stewart's examples of Dunn and Moms for Liberty to expose privatization's inequities. Public forums could showcase data on voucher programs' failures, e.g., lower test scores in religious charters, rallying voters to demand reinvestment in public schools as democratic equalizers. 2. Disrupting power networks. Chapter 4 CNP and Leo expose the movement's reliance on elite coordination. Activists could target these networks with transparency campaigns, filing Freedom of Information Act requests to trace dark money from groups like the Judicial Crisis Network. Publicizing ties between funders and judicial outcomes, say, via a Who Owns the Court website, could pressure lawmakers to reform campaign finance and judicial ethics, weakening the thinker's grip. 3. Countering propaganda. Chapter 5's Permanent Emergency highlights the need to combat disinformation head-on. Local leaders could launch truth brigades, inspired by the Reawaken Tour's successes, training citizens to debunk lies about elections or crises like the Texas blizzard. Partnering with media to amplify fact-based narratives, e.g., tying deregulation to real harm, could undercut the movement's fear-driven hold on the infantry, fostering a return to reason. Part 2. Lies. Chapter 6. The Resentment of the Campus Misfits. Chapter 6. The Resentment of the Campus Misfits plunges into the world of the thinkers, self-styled intellectuals of the new right, whose polished credentials mask a seething grudge. Stewart begins at a Claremont Institute seminar in Southern California, where the air hums with disdain for woke academia. The room is filled with men, almost exclusively men, like Charles Kessler and Scott Yenor, whose Ivy League pedigrees clash with their rhetoric of victimhood. Kessler, a grizzled scholar, rails against multiculturalism as a betrayal of America's Judeo-Christian essence, while Yenor, a Boise State professor, decries gynocracy, a supposed feminist takeover, as the root of societal decay. Stewart paints them as anti-intellectual intellectuals, their eloquence a veneer for reactionary nihilism. She traces their resentment to a perceived snub. Elite campuses, they claim, sidelined them for not towing the progressive line. Stewart recounts a Claremont podcast where a speaker, cloaked in Straussian jargon, laments being canceled by diversity offices, a grievance she finds laughable given their well-funded platforms. These thinkers, she argues, aren't fringe. They're bankrolled by funders like Thomas Klingenstein, a Wall Street magnate whose Claremont donations fuel essays like The Flight 93 Election, a 2016 call to arms framing Trump's candidacy as a last stand against liberal tyranny. The piece, penned by Michael Anton, a Claremont fellow, electrified the movement, blending highbrow theory with apocalyptic fear. Stewart sees this as a psychic conflict, an intra-elite spat masquerading as a populist uprising. The thinkers' lies about a woke elite obscure their own power, sustained by think tanks and billionaire largesse. She visits a Heritage Foundation event where Kessler's ideas are repackaged for the infantry, proving the pipeline from resentment to action. It's not about policy, she concludes, but status anxiety, a rage against a changing world they can't control. Part 2. Lies, Chapter 7. Smashing the Administrative State. Chapter 7. Smashing the Administrative State shifts focus to the movement's practical ambitions, targeting the bureaucratic backbone of American governance. Stewart opens in a Texas conference room, where Heritage Foundation operatives unveil Project 2025, a blueprint for gutting federal agencies under a future Republican president. The mood is triumphant yet secretive, with speakers like Russ Vought, a Trump alum, touting deconstruction as a holy mission. Stewart decodes this buzzword. It's about dismantling regulations, labor protections, and environmental safeguards, all framed as tyranny by a rogue elite. She introduces a key player, Leonard Leo, reprised from Chapter 4, whose Federalist Society has stacked courts with judges primed to bless this agenda. Stewart attends a Federalist gala where Leo's allies celebrate rulings like those of Neil Gorsuch, which weaken agencies like the EPA. The lies here are subtle but pervasive, claims of unelected bureaucrats oppressing real Americans, ignoring how these agencies protect public health and safety. She cites the 2021 Texas blizzard, where deregulation, pushed by funders like Tim Dunn, left millions powerless, a disaster spun as liberal failure. Stewart also spotlights the sergeants, local operatives who translate this vision into action. At a Virginia school board meeting, a Moms for Liberty leader demands parental rights over curricula, echoing Project 2025's call to defund public education. The chapter ties these efforts to economic inequality. Dismantling the state benefits the wealthy, leaving the infantry to cheer their own disenfranchisement. It's a lie of omission, Stewart argues, a promise of freedom that delivers oligarchy. Part 3. Demons, Chapter 8. The Rise of the Spirit Warriors. Chapter 8. The Rise of the Spirit Warriors marks a pivot into Part 3, Demons, where Stewart explores the movement's spiritual fervor. She's back in Las Vegas at a 2023 Reawaken America Tour event, where the crowd pulses with Pentecostal energy. Lance Wallnau, a New Apostolic Reformation (NAR) prophet, takes the stage, his voice booming about Seven Mountains Dominion, Christians seizing control of culture and government. The infantry, many in MAGA gear, chant and sway, some speaking in tongues, as Wallnau casts liberals as demons in a cosmic war. Stewart feels the heat of their zeal, a mix of faith and fury she ties to January 6's violent rhetoric. She introduces the Spirit Warriors, a subset of the infantry radicalized by NAR theology. At a breakout session, a pastor named Jim Garlow drills attendees in spiritual warfare, blending prayer with conspiracy, QAnon, stolen elections, satanic elites. Stewart notes the funding. The Wilkes brothers, Texas oil tycoons from Chapter 5, bankroll this circus, their money amplifying Wallnau's reach. She visits a hardline church in Ohio, where a pastor preaches that democracy is satanic, urging congregants to fight for a theocratic order. The lies here are visceral, fantasies of divine mandate, but they bind the group, offering purpose amid economic decline. Stewart contrasts this with a quieter scene, a Latina congregant, drawn by community, not ideology, hinting at the movement's broad appeal. The spirit warriors, she argues, are inventing a new religion, less about salvation, more about power, fueled by funders and weaponized by sergeants like Garlow. It's a dark evolution, she warns, merging lies with faith to erode democratic norms. Examples for application. Stewart's insights in chapters 6 to 8 offer concrete strategies for countering this anti-democratic tide. Here are 3 examples. 1. Challenging intellectual lies. Chapter SIXS, Campus Misfits, suggest a cultural pushback. Universities and media could host reason over resentment forums, debunking thinkers' claims of woke tyranny with data, e.g., showing diversity offices lack the power Claremont alleges. Publicizing funders like Klingenstein's role via investigative journalism could discredit their victimhood narrative, rallying students and faculty to reclaim intellectual spaces for pluralism. 2. Protecting the administrative state. Chapter 7's Project 2025 exposes a policy vulnerability. Pro-democracy groups could launch a Defend the Common Good campaign, using Stewart's Texas blizzard example to highlight deregulation's human cost, e.g., ads showing families freezing while tycoons profit. Lobbying for agency funding and judicial oversight reforms could thwart Leo's court packing, preserving the state as a democratic bulwark. 3. Countering spiritual extremism. Chapter 8's Spirit Warriors call for community-level action. Interfaith coalitions could organize Faith for Democracy events, drawing on Stewart's Latina congregant to show religion's inclusive potential. Training moderate clergy to counter NAR lies, e.g., workshops debunking 7 mountains as unbiblical, could peel away the infantry, while exposing Wilkes funding via local media might dry up the movement's spiritual fuel. Part 3. Demons. Chapter 9. God and Man in Las Vegas. Chapter 9. God and Man in Las Vegas returns us to the desert city in 2023, where Stewart first glimpsed the movement's raw energy in the introduction. Now, she's at a Pray Vote Stand conference, a glossier cousin of the Reawaken America tour. The venue sparkles with evangelical polish, attendees in pressed suits and sequined crosses, a stark contrast to the t-shirt-clad infantry of earlier rallies. Tony Perkins of the Family Research Council presides, his voice smooth as he urges the crowd to take back America for God. Stewart catches a whiff of desperation beneath the polish. The stakes feel higher, the rhetoric sharper, as if the movement knows time is ticking. She focuses on the spirit warriors, reprised from Chapter 8, now mingling with power players. Sean Foyt, a worship leader turned activist, leads a set of anthems laced with militaristic undertones. We're an army for the Lord, while the crowd sways, some weeping, others clutching voter guides from My Faith Votes. Stewart notes the funding. The National Christian Foundation, NCF, a shadowy donor hub, bankrolls this fusion of faith and politics, linking funders like the Wilkes brothers to the stage. She interviews a young mother, drawn by community but uneasy with the gun imagery on display, hinting at the movement's fragile coalition. The chapter pivots to a breakout session where a pastor preaches dominion theology, echoing Lance Wallnau's 7 Mountains vision. Stewart sees this as a new religion, less about salvation, more about control, fueled by lies of divine mandate. She ties it to January 6th, recalling how such rhetoric incited the patriots, now lionized here. Las Vegas, she argues, is a microcosm, a city of excess where the movement's spiritual fervor meets its political ambition, a volatile mix threatening democratic norms. Part 3. Demons. Chapter 10. No Exit. Chapter 10. No Exit takes a darker turn, exploring the movement's existential trap. Stewart visits a hardline church in rural Pennsylvania, where a pastor named Doug Mastriano, once a January 6th figurehead, preaches to a dwindling flock. The pews are half empty, the air heavy with defeatism. Mastriano rails against satanic elites, but his tone is weary, his vision, a Christian nation, slipping into fantasy. Stewart senses a paradox. The movement's fervor has no endgame. Its promises unfulfillable, leaving adherents in a cycle of rage and despair. She introduces the infantry's burnout, interviewing a former spirit warrior who left after January 6th. He confesses the lies, stolen elections, divine anointings, kept him hooked, but the lack of tangible wins eroded his faith. Stewart ties this to the thinker's nihilism from Chapter 6. The movement thrives on destruction, not creation. At a Moms for Liberty meeting in Florida, she watches a sergeant push book bans, only to admit privately that winning feels hollow, schools stay woke, resentment festers. The title nods to Sartre. There's no exit from this hell of grievance. Stewart contrasts this with the funders' gains, tax cuts, deregulation, suggesting the infantry are pawns in a game they can't win. She visits a Texas rally where a Wilkes-backed speaker promises greatness again, but the crowd's cheers feel rote. The chapter argues that the movement's spiritual lies, America as a chosen nation, lock it into a dead end, a reactionary nihilism that offers pain, not progress, sustained by the sergeant's relentless agitation. Part 3. Demons, Chapter 11. Exporting the Counter-Revolution. Chapter 11. Exporting the Counter-Revolution zooms out to the global stage, where the movement seeks allies in its war on democracy. Stewart returns to Verona, Italy, from 2019, but now tracks its echoes in 2023 Budapest at a national conservatism conference, knack. Viktor Orbán, Hungary's strongman, keynotes his praise for illiberal democracy, met with applause from American thinkers like Rusty Reno of First Things. Stewart feels the chill. This isn't just tourism. It's a blueprint exchange, with U.S. funders like Rebecca Mercer bankrolling the trip. She highlights the World Congress of Families, WCF, a nexus of U.S. Russian-European reactionaries. In Budapest, Alexei Kamov, a Russian oligarch tied to Putin, huddles with Perkins and Leo, plotting against global liberalism. Stewart notes the irony. A movement decrying elites cozies up to foreign kleptocrats. She attends a London knack event, where Heritage Foundation reps push Project 2025 abroad, urging allies to deconstruct their own states. The lies here: America as a beacon of freedom, turned counter-revolutionary, mask a shared goal, authoritarianism under a Christian veneer. Stewart ties this to domestic impact. Orbán's tactics inspire U.S. voter suppression, while Russian troll farms amplify election lies. She interviews a Polish activist fighting law and justice, Peace, a WCF ally, who warns of America's export eroding her democracy. The chapter frames the movement as a global virus, its demons of faith and fear infecting allies, with funders and power players as carriers. Examples for application. Stewart's insights in chapters 9 to 11 offer actionable strategies to counter this anti-democratic wave. Here are 3 examples. 1. Reclaiming faith communities. Chapter 9's Las Vegas fervor suggests a spiritual counteroffensive. Progressive clergy could launch Faith for All initiatives, inspired by the uneasy Mother Stewart met, offering inclusive worship that rejects dominionism. Partnering with groups like the NCF's critics, e.g., exposing its funding via tax filings, could pressure funders, while training congregants to spot spirit warrior lies could reclaim faith for democracy. 2. Breaking the nihilist cycle. Chapter 10's No Exit highlights the infantry's burnout. Community organizers could create hope over hate programs, using the ex-warrior's story to offer ex-members job training or counseling, addressing economic roots of their rage. Public campaigns, e.g., billboards showing deregulation's real cost, could counter Sargent's lies, giving the infantry a tangible alternative to nihilism. 3. Countering global spread. Chapter 11's counter-revolution calls for international solidarity. U.S. activists could form a democracy alliance with European counterparts, like the Polish activist, sharing tactics to expose WCF ties, e.g., joint reports on Mercer's funding. Pressuring lawmakers to sanction foreign influencers like Kamov, while amplifying pro-democracy voices via social media, could curb the movement's global reach. Conclusion. In chapters 9 to 11, Stewart unveils a movement teetering between ecstatic faith, existential despair, and global ambition. From Las Vegas's fervent warriors to Pennsylvania's weary faithful and Budapest's authoritarian pact, she maps a web of demons, spiritual, cultural, and geopolitical, threatening democracy's soul. Her narrative, alive with Perkins's polish, Mastriano's weariness, and Orban's smirk, grounds the stakes in human terms. For resistors, her work is a rallying cry. Reclaim faith, break the cycle, and fight globally. As the book nears its end, the urgency sharpens, demanding action against a movement that's both fragile and ferocious. The final reckoning, the conclusion of money, lies, and God. In the conclusion of money, lies, and God, Katherine Stewart stands at the edge of the abyss she's mapped across 11 chapters, gazing back at the sprawling movement she's tracked from Las Vegas to Budapest. The air feels heavy, not with defeat, but with resolve, as she weaves together the threads of money, lies, and demons into a stark warning. America's democracy hangs by a thread, frayed by a coalition of funders, thinkers, sergeants, infantry, and power players. She doesn't linger on despair, though. This isn't a dirge but a clarion call, delivered with the quiet urgency of someone who's seen the beast up close. Stewart begins with a memory, a quiet moment at a 2023 rally, where a woman in a Jesus Saves shirt whispered doubts about the movement's rage, a flicker of hope amid the chaos. It's this tension between the movement's fervor and its fragility that she seizes on. The funders' billions, from Dunn to Mercer, have built a machine of privatized schools and packed courts. The thinkers' lies, from Claremont to Heritage, have cloaked nihilism and scholarship. The sergeants and infantry have turned churches and school boards into battlegrounds, and the power players have exported their counter-revolution globally. Yet, she argues, it's brittle, held together by resentment and fear, not unity or vision. She paints the stakes vividly. A future where elections bend to minority rule, public goods vanish under deregulation, and a theocratic fantasy supplants the Enlightenment ideals of equality and reason. But Stewart isn't here to mourn. She urges readers to act, trace the money, expose the lies, and reclaim the democratic spirit. Her final scene is a rally's edge, where that doubting woman walks away, a reminder that the infantry can fracture, the machine can stall. This is not inevitable, she insists, her voice steady. Democracy dies only if we let it. I hope that you've enjoyed this video, and please remember to subscribe to receive notification of upcoming recordings. See you in next video.